Hello everyone, today we talk about the 424 BC campaign of Delium. During the Peloponnesian War, we're gonna look essentially both at the strategical and tactical developments of the campaign with the Battle of Delium proper, that it was the major event of the campaign. This is a very important campaign in many ways because especially it's very useful in my opinion to hear after that video I made a couple of weeks ago about the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria of the year before, so it's a kind of a continuation. And in fact it displays, albeit with less details, but nevertheless not less meaningful details, the transformations that were occurring into Hellenic Warfare this time of the Peloponnesian War, and this progressive transition towards a more, say, dynamic warfare was essentially evolving from the traditional classical hoplite warfare that was, at least in theory, in origin, ideally speaking, this very ritualized clash only between hoplites in a given open field with a in plain. And the Peloponnesian War was what went to essentially change this, because the Greeks started fighting not just outside of the motherland, but also outside of those environments that were used to and where they had developed their political system in. And so they had to face also with other challenges, that is, warfare that was extended also in other parts of the year compared to the usually seasonal one, certain conditions that had necessarily to transform their army. And the campaign of Delium has many points in common, actually, also with the one of Pylos and Sphacteria in the essentials. Here, essentially, the Athenians were on the offensive. The year before, 425, they had won this big victory over Sparta. They had seized couple of hundreds of Spartiates themselves, and on the island of Sphacteria. Now they had a great bargaining power, and they turned their attention towards the major Spartan ally that were the Thebans, the Boeotians. So the strategy the Athenians adopted to attack Thebes was essentially to repeat this naval assault on these coastal centers, this time of Boeotia. The one of Pylos and Sphacteria were in Messenia, in the Peloponnese. So the strategy was basically seizing these coastal centers, fortified centers that could be held by even a relatively few men, that therefore didn't cost much, but that could serve not just as a potential bridgehead for a further invasion, but also and especially they were sort of reference point for all the pro-Athenian partisans that existed, or at least those who wanted essentially to overthrow the current Theban government at this point. And these two centers, and naturally Athenian was using at its best its thalassocratic power. At this point, this was mainly the problem of the Athenians, that they had a very powerful fleet, what we can call a maritime empire at this point, but they were not strong enough on land to face in open field the Spartans. The campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria expresses this beautifully. The Athenians, even if they were sometimes even with a huge numerical advantage on the Spartans, they didn't dare to meet them in open ground. Also because the same Athenian resources were kind of limited. Even a defeat at this point, even if these were very wealthy in populated cities, even losing, I don't know, thousands of men was kind of a demic disaster in terms of manpower, of especially internal political balance that could shift. So the Athenians had not no interest substantially in meeting these Spartans on land, inland. The Spartans launched periodically certain raids into Attica, so trying to undermine the Athenian agricultural power, but without much of a strategic effect, as the Athenians could they still had enough resources on their own. They could make other, resources imported to Athens. They especially had their fortified port of the Piraeum, that was, or Piraeus in Greek, that basically prevented the city to be taken from the sea. The Spartans didn't have a maritime power, so this was at this point a sort of strategical stall for which the Athenians, that now had definitely the upper hand overall on the situation, decided to carry out this strategy of occupation of coastal centers to make the local populations revolt, either for Sparta and Thebes and so on. Boeotia had helped, especially the Spartans, providing the cavalry that joined the Spartan army during the raids into Attica. So they had this, and were this open enemy, let's say, of the Athenians. So given this introduction, we can essentially, I think today, instead of making something, preparing something on my own, I think it's better to read directly from Thucydides, so that we get all the details, all the narration perfectly told, and therefore here we go. So forgive me, I mark, which part of the speech I will have to put the pictures, and here we start. Thucydides, the Peloponnesian War, 476. So this is the beginning. I will of the campaign, how the Athenians figure out to invade these two coastal centers of Boeotia, and it goes on. Then there is a bit of a jump where but we change later. Every once in a while I will comment if I find something that I think it's interesting, but Thucydides is much better than me telling the story. So let's just do it. I'm using the translation by J.M. Dent, New York, and 1910. This is open source. It's public access. There's this beautiful site that is www.perseus.tufts.edu. Is a very good source. Very good source provider. We can say it's plenty of classical sources, and this is good. I'm sorry I can't read the original. I could, because there is also the Greek text in here, but I think I will trust now for the narration that is otherwise relatively simple in the essentials, but it still tells more than anything very interesting concepts in how this campaign was carried out. So I drink a little bit before I go on, so I start talking. Or better, Thucydides, well, in English. Not in Greek, but whatever. So, the same summer, the Athenian general Demosthenes arrived at Naupactus with 40 ships immediately after the return from the Megarid. Hippocrates and himself had had overtures made to them by certain men in the cities of Boeotia, who wished to change the constitution and introduce a democracy as at Athens. Theodorus, a Theban exile, being the chief mover in this intrigue. The seaport town of Siphae, in the Bay of Chrysae, in the Tespian territory, was to be betrayed to them by one party. Chaeronea, a dependency of what was formerly called the Menian, now the Boeotian or Comenus, to be put in their hands by another from that town, whose exiles were very active in the business, hiring men in the Peloponnese. Some Phocians also were in the plot, Chaeronea being at the front town of Boeotia and close to Phanotis in Phocis. Meanwhile, the Athenians were to seize Delium, the sanctuary of Apollo, in the territory of Tanagra, looking towards Euboea. And all these events were to take place simultaneously upon a day appointed, in order that the Boeotians might be unable to unite to oppose them at Delium, being everywhere detained by disturbances at home. Should the enterprise succeed, and Delium be fortified, its authors confidently expected that even if no revolution should immediately follow in Boeotia, Yet, with these places in their hands and the country being harassed by incursions, and a refuge in each instance near for the partisans engaged in them, things would not remain as they were, but that the rebels being supported by the Athenians, and the forces of the oligarchs divided, it would be possible after a while to settle matters according to their wishes. So at the end of this chapter, everything is kind of very clear. So the Athenians wanted essentially to support the democratic partisans into Boeotia. So by seizing simultaneously these two cities on the Boeotian coast from the opposite sides, one side from the kind of Ionian Sea, the other from the Aegean Sea. The idea was to do it simultaneously, so that basically this presents certain strategical advantages, because basically the enemy has either to cope only with one of the assaults, either to split forces, and this naturally weakens the capacity of reaction. The Athenians were naturally exploiting their maritime power by, it was extremely fast, making, moving an army, forces by sea was extremely cheaper and faster than doing it by land. And they could do it because they had a very strong fleet that now was practically unopposed. So they were exploiting really their own advantages, and this strategy overall was really fine. So at this point, the Athenians didn't screw up. Everything was well conceived in terms of objectives, and this is important because just a year before there was in Athens certain relative in that case, of course, that was in the Peloponnesian. But I mean, this idea of fortifying coastal centers and to create this kind of rallying point for all the democratic partisans against, in that case, Sparta, in this case now Thebes, was not really thought, and this was, however, very clever, because as we have seen, these centers could be relatively easily held. Siege warfare at that point was not excessively developed at this time. The Greeks didn't still have bolt shooting engines and stuff like that, so the still also Poliorcetic was relatively, I can say, primitive, because we will see, especially at the end of this campaign, what happened to the Athenian fortifications in Delium, as the Thebans came up to something very, even technologically sophisticated for the time, to storm them. But the concept is that you could hold a very well fortified place very effectively for a long time. At Pylos, especially, that had been seen that even a very good, albeit small, fortified position could be stormed with enormous difficulty. In that case, it was not always the case, but anyhow. In that case, the Spartans had troubles even bringing siege weaponry there, or to put up it, because these cities were not used to even increase. In fact, toward their military potential from that point of view was expensive. And this is also what gives you the idea of this progressive evolution, also in the mindset. The Peloponnesian War was this great moment of also the expansion of the Hellenic horizons in many ways. So, and here, interestingly enough, Thucydides says something very important, that is, didn't matter whether, there could be, an immediate political upheaval in Thebes and so on, but, these two centers would have created confusion, because they would have the city would have these two centers relatively close, from where the enemy partisans could launch raids, assaults, and so on. So the situation was more unstable, and this is actually the Schwerpunkt. Here, the main point was not destroying Thebes, it was not seizing it, in direct military campaign. It was enough to make just internal political balance shift towards the Democratic Party, the pro-Athenian one, and that was fine. So we pass to the following chapter, 477. Such was the plot in contemplation. Hippocrates, with a force raised at home, awaited for the proper moment to take the field against the Boeotians, while he sent on Demosthenes with the 40 ships above mentioned to Naupactus to raise in those parts an army of Acarnanians and of the other allies, and sail and receive Siphae from the conspirators. They having been agreed on for the simultaneous execution of both of these operations. Demosthenes, on his arrival, found Oniade already compelled by the united Acarnanians to join the Athenian confederacy, and himself raising all the allies in those countries marched against and subdued Salentius and the Agrarians, after which he devoted himself to the preparations necessary to enable him to be at Siphae by the time appointed. So here we see a bit of a essentially also political testing, finding allies, kind of also influencing others to prepare, to pave the road for this this offensive. Now, the important thing was to coordinate these two attacks into different, simultaneously into these opposed ports, I'd say geographically speaking, of Boeotia. And this was arguably already, the most challenging thing, because the distances in here were not great. So even a delay, a problem of this kind of would happen, in fact, would give the Thebans the chance basically to cope with both invasions, in different times with full strength, and making this initial surprise that the Athenians were counting on fail. So at this point, really, the problem was also more political than military, because the risk, as if it happened, was also that someone could warn the Thebans before. Excuse me, I closed the window a little bit. I should make these videos at another hour, because now it's getting hotter in weather, and I would like to keep the window open when I'm speaking in here, but at this time there's always some mess outside, like workers and stuff. Yeah, sorry for that. So this was it. So now Thucydides goes on with other other details about other countries. It talks about trades and so on. So we jump directly to the from chapter 77 to chapter 89 of the book 4, Peloponnesian War, and let's see what the Athenians did. So it was in the first days of the winter following that the places in Boeotia were to be put into the hands of the Athenian generals Hippocrates and Demosthenes, the latter of whom was to go with his ships to Siphae, the former to Delium. A mistake, however, was made in the days on which they were each to start, and Demosthenes, sailing first to Siphae with the Acarnanians and many of the allies from those parts on board, failed to effect anything through the plot having been betrayed by Nicomachus, a Phocian from Phanotis, who told the Lacedaemonians, yes, and they the Boeotians. Succors accordingly flocked into from all parts of Boeotia, Hippocrates not being yet there to make his diversion, and Siphae and Chaeronea were promptly secured, and the conspirators, informed of the mistake, did not venture on any movement in the towns. So realize here basically the attempt to seize Siphae and Chaeronea here in the Corinthian Gulf failed, as the Thebans, as feared, were warned about this by an agent, by a betrayer, who gave them in time the information the Athenians were to land in there, and therefore the Boeotians were, here it says also interestingly, that from all parts of Boeotia there were someone who was going to help Thebes, and they secured these coastal centers of Siphae and also Chaeronea to and basically the Athenians couldn't make a headway through that and couldn't seize it. There's also here, in fact, a lack of coordination, as we've seen, and this was also kind of a problem. Just imagine at the time, what the communications could be. Doing these joint operations was something also that could just think also of nature of technology and the environment. Many things could go wrong. So this had an intrinsic risk in itself as an operation, but if they had succeeded, probably the Athenians would have gained something more. And these are the odds of war. There is no such thing like a perfect plan. So let's see what happened to Hippocrates at this point. Meanwhile, Hippocrates made a levy in mass of the citizens, resident aliens, and foreigners in Athens, and arrived at his destination after the Boeotians had already come back from Siphe. And encamping his army began to fortify Delium, the sanctuary of Apollo, in the following manner. A trench was dug all around the temple and the consecrated ground, and the earth thrown up from the excavation was made to do duty as a wall, in which stakes were also planted, the vines round the sanctuary being cut down and thrown in, together with stones and bricks pulled down from the houses near. Every means, in short, being used to round up the rampart. Wooden towers were also erected where they were wanted, and where there was no part of the temple buildings left standing, as on the side where the gallery once existing had fallen in. The work was begun on the third day after leaving home, and continued during the fourth until dinner time of the fifth, when most of it being now finished, the army removed from Delium about a mile and a quarter on its way home. From this point most of the light troops were straight on, while the heavy infantry halted and remained where they were. Hippocrates, having stayed behind Delium to range the posts and to give directions for the completion of such part of the outworks, had been left unfinished. So here we see, in fact, the operations of the Corinthian Gulf had failed. Now Hippocrates makes it. He advances. It takes 3 days basically to advance from Athens with this army to Delium. This army was made up by both heavy hoplites, the traditional, phalanx, if you want, and these lighter troops that appear always in greater numbers at this point. We've seen also in the campaign of Pylos and Sphacteria how important they had been. I made also a video about the psiloi, actually for the Hellenistic times, not really for classical times, but they're essentially the same. If you go into the Ancient Warfare playlist, you should find it. It's called there's also classical Hellenic slingers that were also present, and Hellenistic light infantry, psiloi / gymnetes. And what they do is very simple. They just had to seize this sanctuary of Apollo, that is, we've seen, was also partly ruinous, and to fortify it. And this was, in fact, done in a couple of days. In creating this outpost into the Boeotian territory. And this is it. This was it. The main point was just to practically build this fortification before the Theban army could arrive, because that equated to having a huge advantage. Just think about the sheer energy required at this point. In 2 days you could build. This is typical of the ancient world of pre-gunpowder warfare. If you build this kind of even small fort, that it can hold for a long time, substantially, at least for enough time for it to be reinforced by someone else. And as we've seen, Athens was just a few days of march from there. So essentially, this was a pain in the behind, having this fortified position in your own territory for the Thebans, and not being able to do very much about it. And as long as this sanctuary is fortified, the Athenian army comes back, because there was no need to do mission accomplished, and that was really the point. Also, interestingly enough, here it says that Hippocrates, while the main army had left, was still at Delium to finish the outworks in here, the arrangement of the garrison. And also, very interestingly, here it says that the Athenian army was essentially coming home split in two, as the lighter troops had come essentially forward. They had left before, and the heavier hoplites were kind of instead certain mile behind. This is interesting also, just you can imagine logistical differences and so on, but really the different nature of this kind of troops. And that the Hellenic armies at this point were still using naturally the Hellenic Phalanx, and they would keep using it as the main army, but it's really the amount of this lighter troops that really tells you that, especially in these operations that were not even meant, in fact, like now to escalate in open, pitched battles in an open clash. All these lighter troops were kind of very important because they could seize the terrain where the phalanx could not go, because otherwise it would have get disordered and so on, and just provide that kind of shield, this scattered presence around the phalanx could essentially prepare its road and look at passages, scouting, skirmishing, ambushing, and so on, and letting the phalanx in this sense safer. Excuse me, I drink a little bit once again. Yeah. So here we go on 91. So what were the Thebans doing at this point? Well, during these days, to say that this goes, thus employed the Boeotians were mustering at Tanagra, and by the time that they had come in from all the towns, found the Athenians already on their way home. The rest of the 11 Boeotarchs were against giving battle, as the enemy was no longer in Boeotia, the Athenians being just over the European border when they halted. But Pagondas, son of Aeolides, one of the Boeotarchs of Thebes, Arintides, son of Lysimachus, being the other, and then commander-in-chief, thought it best to hazard a battle. He accordingly called the men to him, company after company, to prevent their all leaving their arms at once, and urged them to attack the Athenians and send the issue of a battle, speaking as follows. So here are some famous speeches of Thucydides' Peloponnesian War. Can be interesting to read it. Boeotians, the idea that we ought not to give battle to the Athenians unless we came up with them in Boeotia is one of which should never have entered into the head of any of us, your generals. It was to annoy Boeotia that they crossed the frontier and built a fort in our country, and they are therefore, I imagine, our enemies wherever we may come up with them, and from wheresoever they may have come to act as enemies do. And if anyone has taken up with the idea in question for reasons of safety, it is high time for him to change his mind. The party attacked, whose own country is in danger, can scarcely discuss what is prudent with the calmness of men who are in full enjoyment of what they have got, and are thinking of attacking a neighbor in order to get more. It is your national habit, in your country or out of it, to oppose the same resistance to a foreign invader, and when that invader is Athenian and lives upon your frontier besides, it is doubly imperative to do so. As between neighbors generally, freedom means simply a determination to hold one's own. And with neighbors like these, who are trying to enslave near and far alike, there is nothing for it but to fight it out to the last. Look at the condition of the Boeotians and most of the rest of Hellas, and be convinced that others have to fight with their neighbors for this frontier or that, but that for us conquest means one frontier for the whole country, about which no dispute can be made, for they will simply come and take by force what we have. So much more have we to fear from this neighbor than from another. Besides, people who, like the Athenians in the present instance, are tempted by pride of strength to attack their neighbors, usually march most confidently against those who keep still and only defend themselves in their own country, but think twice before they grapple with those who meet them outside their frontier and strike the first blow if the opportunity offers. The Athenians have shown us this themselves. The defeat which we inflicted upon them at Coronea, at the time when our quarrels had allowed them to occupy the country, has given great security to Boeotia until the present day. Remembering this, the old must equal their ancient exploit, and the young, the sons of the years of that time, must endeavor not to disgrace their native valor, and trusting in the help of the god whose temple has been sacrilegiously fortified, and in the victim which in our sacrifices have proved propitious, we must march against the enemy, and teach him that he must go and get what he wants by attacking someone who will not resist him, but that men whose glory it is to be always ready to give battle for the liberty of their own country, and never unjustly to enslave that of others, will not let him go without a struggle. So this is a speech naturally not just against Athenian imperialism, but it also observes what essentially the strategical condition of Boeotia was, as this mainly obviously terrestrial power, not even so large, and therefore at this point where the Boeotian army was seen that basically the Athenians had made it before they could arrive and interfere to Delium to fortify the sanctuary, and the Athenian army was even now coming back inside it was already inside the same Athenian territory. They hadn't wanted to attack them. And it's very interesting because it says here that the Pagondas basically had called up all the parts of the Boeotian army, company by company, it says. So really there is still this strong idea that it's a citizen phalanx, that more or less the decision of the citizenry are the decision of the of the state in practice, of the polis. So in here instead the two commanders of the Theban army say no, we have to stay, because this is not something we can simply get over with. Like the Athenians have basically seized one part of our territory. They even seized a temple that is sacred to us, and we have the duty to attack them, not to make them think they can resist. Also, because if this is our land proper, so the Athenians might go, invade foreign lands and also maybe losing them, partly of them back. But this is not like that for us. That this is our land. It's the only one we have. We only one frontier essentially, and if we let the enemy seizing parts of it, we're kind of giving up for no reason. Naturally, here there is naturally much rhetoric involved, but nevertheless, it shows what kind of the odds here were. And the idea of attacking at this point shows definitely also the confidence of these commanders that were to, in fact, achieve a substantial victory, and also this kind of aggressivistic tactical mindset is to be shown also in the way the Theban army was arranged. That also, interestingly, kind of anticipates some of the developments that would happen with Epaminondas' oblique order 50 years after, would be used actually against the Spartans at that point, but really showing that this area, that Boeotia was considered a sort of borderline Hellenic land. The idea that for the Athenians, the true Greeks were essentially the Athenians, the Spartans, and so on. Boeotia was already considered like a strange place with a kind of half barbaric tongue, and it is very interesting to see how actually these were lands that objectively were kind of more different from the communities of northern Greece were kind of also less, they had a less development, a minor development of the polis compared to cities like like Athens, indeed, like Athens, sorry, and so on. So, but they were at the same time certain lands that, in virtue of these characteristics, were kind of developing other, or maybe already had by default, another military mindset, and were kind to adapt, even though these still also fought with, they already fought and normally with the politic phalanx and so on, because the polis was conceptually essentially the same thing. There were certain characteristics that we'll see now that eventually brought them also to implement new tactics, as a matter of fact, that were also pretty effective on the field. So Thucydides goes on. We had chapter 93. We're progressing. So from now we don't jump chapter by chapter, but every once in a while I'll tell you where we are. Just follow if you have the text. So by these arguments, Pagondas persuaded Boeotians to attack the Athenians. Quickly breaking up his camp, led his army forward, it being now late in the day. On nearing the enemy, he halted in a position where a hill intervening prevented the two armies from seeing each other, and then formed and prepared for action. So you realize a very immediate attack. This was done evidently also to kind of exploit the situation, as the Athenian army was just on its way home. So also these various bodies of the army were kind of split. So attacking at this point was very important, and wiping out the Athenian army at this point could mean to reseize, in fact, Delium, and basically reverse the tides of these campaigns, as you see the Thebans were already prepared, to fight the Athenians, to arrive before they could fortify Delium. Once they saw that it was already done, they essentially they wanted to give up, and instead the commanders understand that they still can, by wiping out the Athenian army, change the whole situation and restore it. On nearing the enemy, he halted. This is Pagondas. He was essentially the commander-in-chief of the Theban army. He halted in a position where a hill intervening prevented the two armies from seeing each other, and then formed and prepared for action. Yeah, I already read it, but it's important. This is a thing to know. There was a hill in the middle, and this is what the campaign of Delium was formed like. It was fought like. This is important because it's not like it would be in a normal situation. This is also one of the elements of transformation of the the traditional political warfare that was usually fought in political battles were usually fought on very different terrains. That also in here, it's very difficult to say, whether there had ever been a perfectly ideal political battle, because every battle was kind of different on its own. But here we have even a hill separating the two armies. And this is important because it tells you that, among the other things, naturally, that there are many ways to see understand where the enemy is. But there was also probably a lot of scouting involved, and also the participation of those light troops was very important on this rough terrain and so on. So, going on, meanwhile, Hippocrates at Delium, informed of the approach of the Boeotians, sent orders to his troops to throw themselves into line, and himself joined them not long afterwards, leaving about 300 horse behind him at Delium, at once to guard the place in case of attack, and to watch their opportunity and fall upon the Boeotians during the battle. So this is very important. So basically, Hippocrates is informed of the Theban attack. So he orders his troops to deploy in line quickly, as otherwise they might have been caught in in an unsuitable array that might have simply rendered useless any resistance. And he leaves this 300. He joins eventually the same phalanx, it was lining up, and he leaves 300 horsemen at Delium. So these horsemen were probably equipped for battle. Excuse me, for an eventual fight. There were actually mounted hoplites. At least hoplites rode to battle, sometimes on horseback. This is also very probably overlooked aspect of Greek warfare this time. I mean, who were these cavalrymen? As we've seen, the Spartans, for instance, didn't have a great deal of cavalry, seemingly. It wasn't a big much, but they still had. The Thebans usually provided this better cavalry that we will see also how what role it had an important role during the battle, and the Athenians had, and they used this cavalry force both as a garrison for the defense of Delium, and also as a as a reserve, essentially, that could a quick deploying force that could intervene during the battle in case of need. And 300 cavalry is not really a few at this point. And that traditionally in athletic battles, cavalry allegedly had no importance, not a great importance at least. But also this is a bit of maybe a cliche. It was mostly the democratic Attis that didn't that had built the polis essentially in opposition to the cavalries of the tyrants, these lords that could fight on horseback and so on, so that the classical sources tend to kind of marginalize the effective importance of cavalry on these battlefields. But it's important that now this cavalry is openly used as something important, and that the Hellenic sources, like Thucydides, recognize now their potential, their effectiveness. So this is it's an important moment of change in Hellenic warfare. The Boeotians placed a detachment to deal with these. And when everything, so with these meaning with the Athenian cavalry, and when everything was arranged to their satisfactions, to their satisfaction, appeared over the hill and halted in the order which they had determined on, to the number of 7,000 heavy infantry, more than 10,000 light troops, 1,000 horse, and 500 targeteers. So it was a hell of an army, actually. So it is 7,000 hoplites, more than 10,000 light troops, that naturally were individually much weaker than every single skirmisher was much weaker than a hoplite. But in this difficult terrain, en masse, they could really be very useful to harass the enemy, to lure it, to hammer it with these javelins. 1,000 horse, interestingly enough, so it is strong Theban cavalry, and 500 targeteers. That is, here I don't know what term he uses into Greek, but nevertheless, I mean, these troops were essentially meant to especially be kind of sharpshooters of some sort. Among the light troops, naturally, this could still also engage into hand-to-hand combat. Preferably not, because obviously, especially against the hoplites, they were at the heavy. The whole thing, like we've seen also in Pylos and Sphacteria, was maybe getting very close to throw something at the hoplites, but running back and exploiting their light equipment to never to be reached by hoplites. But the hoplites now also were developing certain specializations for which some of them could run faster. Hoplites also in here during the Peloponnesian War were getting increasingly lighter in equipment, so that they could also react more effectively to these forms of attacks and so on. But I mean, these were probably also skirmishing troops. They were equipped with javelins, with slings and stuff like that. The 500 targeteers here are probably something more specialistic in missile weapon, but still the essentials were kind of similar. And naturally, the light troops could contrast also the Athenian light troops in part. So here it goes on with the deployment. On their right were the Thebans and those of their province in the centers of their province. In the center, the Haliartians, Coronans, Copaeans, and the other people around the lake. And on the left, the Tespians, Tanagraeans, and Orchomenians. The cavalry and the light troops being at the extremity of each wing. The Thebans formed 25 shields deep, the rest as they pleased. Such was the strength and disposition of the Boeotian army. Now, this is kind of very important because the if you look at the deployment, you realize that the these two things are important. First of all, the cavalry and light troops put together, essentially, on the wings. So this idea that they could be a mobile force that could outflank the enemy and carry out this possible flanking maneuvers and attacks from the side, from the rear even, if they were able to encircle the enemy. And this was very important because naturally, especially hoplites that represented the bulk of the enemy army, it was also a very costly type of fighter, could be in this sense pursued and taken, either made prisoners or even slaughtered. So the role of these troops was very, very important and could give also a great, not just tactical but also strategical edge in the case of victory, because they could pursue the enemy and make a greater loss, to inflict a greater loss to manpower, to the enemy manpower. Another very interesting thing here is the the phalanx was essentially split. The Theban phalanx was deployed in line, but split in three. And the most interesting thing is that the Thebans make up the right flank, which is not strange in itself because the right flank was the strongest of the phalanx for many reasons. Here the Thebans had, as you know, Thebes being the main center of Boeotia, having the best hoplites, as urban classes that could equip themselves in the hoplitic fashion. But the most interesting thing is the 25 shields. Here it says deep. In the Greek sources, the shield is always, also in the Greek names of the units, the shield is always at the center of the thing. If you take the Roman units, that were usually called after the weapon that we're using. In the Greek world, it was kind of the shield that we're using. This is very important. It tells you also the kind of different emphasis, the different nature and military mindset of these two peoples, how they saw their the shield was a bit the symbol of the phalanx in itself, even before the spear. As such, this idea that the strength came from this mostly defensive function of the phalanx. And this 25 shield depth is very interesting because it resembles definitely what, as we were saying before, the developments that would have occurred 50 years later with the Epaminondas at the Battle of Leuctra. I mean, this idea that the phalanx had basically to run and to as a in that case was to basically run up to the Spartan ranks before these were being formed, and therefore to launch this column of men, and they were all pushing one against the other, so making this othismus, this pressing that could shatter the with sheer numbers, with brute force, the order of the Spartan phalanx. And this time we find something similar. So we see in among the Thebans, in their mindset at the end of 5th century, already this idea of having the best of their troops to be kind of a spearhead, meant to charge, to press on, even more, narrowly, more directly than having just a line that instead has to absorb the hit. So kind of a more aggressivistic tactic mindset, that was meant to shatter instead, was with more impetus, with more emphasis put on even on the charge. It was something usually rare and very difficult to perform for a phalanx usually, because these troops were not meant for that. The phalanx lost cohesion very easily, with the usual exception of the Spartans. None of these Hellenic troops were anything like professional. The classical hoplitic phalanx is conceived as the non-professional unit pro excellence, because that was the concept around which the whole political ideal of the Greeks revolved around. The idea that professionalism, war professionalism is something that only barbarians do, because it's barbarians who fought all their life. The hoplites wanted to win through this kind of reason, this kind of minimal effort that didn't require training and so on, because that were all resources taken off from other activities, the activities of these commoners, of these craftsmen, of these people who lived in the urban centers. Only the Spartans had instead this kind of feudal society for which there were citizens, but there were many people working for them, and all they did was war. Also in there, not even for Greek standards were the best, but if you take any kind of, Celtic or Italic or where a warrior, these were much more trained, of course, in terms of especially the individual training. Then naturally the collective training was lower, but it's not that the Spartans also were this enormous much into the ancient warfare. They just were for Hellenic standards, as a matter of fact. Excuse me, I drink a little once again. And the right flank was the most important one in the phalanx. I didn't say this because the phalanx had a huge problem. It was, first of all, as we've just said, this lack of collective training, essentially. The Greeks had this occasions, like when, even during festivals and so on, when it kind of trained a little bit, but it was not an intensive collective training. The phalanx was at this time ordered, and it was very simply I don't know how to say this, but it didn't require a lot of training. It wasn't required, conceptually speaking. It was proper, as we've seen just now, of all the Greeks except the Spartans. And one of the great problems was to maintain cohesion, therefore, on the field, because one thing is having an intensely trained unit that can maintain formation in very difficult situations, and in this the Spartans were excellent at doing it. We've seen it also in Sphacteria, that even being surrounded by all these Athenian skirmishers, suffering heavy losses, they managed to retreat orderly to keep the cohesion of the phalanx, and this is the witness to their very intense training. The phalanx had problems even into advancing on the field, and that's why also the Greeks had ideally, always preferred to kind of meet on a certain ground that was suitable for phalanx warfare, not to with a flat land with no major obstacles and so on. And this is why now, during the Peloponnesian War, having the horizons of the Greeks expanded, having to fight in lands were also geographically different from their Hellenic motherland, they now were meeting also different grounds for which they needed different types of troops. Also, these light troops were conceived exactly for this fighting this rough terrain. Mercenaries were hired also from these populations of Thrace, of these peoples that lived in these mountainous and forested terrains, that for which they were best suited for, also suitable for fighting in. So one of the main problems of phalanx was also not just maintaining the frontal cohesion that was vital in phalanx warfare, because it was literally all revolving around how cohesive was to the front and how much could resist while clashing with the enemy. And this was it. It was just like football players, all pressing one against the other. There was no other thing, no major technique, but just this physical strength involved. Paradoxically, a warrior had a much greater technical skill than an hoplite. That was the reliance that just on sheer physical force, because that's what all it did. Concentrating this effort in that direction point. Another problem was that during the advance, of the phalanx against the enemy in open field, the phalanx would tend to shift right. This happened because essentially you bore your shield, you carried your shield on your left, and you were kind of rotated, slightly rotated to make it, cover your front that was exposed to the enemy. So instinctively, you would basically refuse your right side and trying to expose the left one, and in this sense shifting you progressively towards the right. So this shift happened all the time. So it was very difficult to control, because when you have a phalanx of thousands, it's very difficult to control the movement of the whole force. There is kind of this attrition factor that brings the phalanx to shift towards the right. So the right section of the phalanx was the one who had the highest quality, that is the highest training, the highest ability to maintain cohesion and to walk also straight ahead. So to compensate also physically speaking the right push of the rest of the phalanx. So that's why also this was not just in the army as a whole, but also in the various sections of the phalanx, that usually the toughest guys, the ones who were more trained, also more physically strong, were placed at the top right of the phalanx, because that was the place where there was the most that could control basically the cohesion of the rest of the unit by absorbing this right push. It's always been like that. Every unit that had to stick in this kind of full battlefield with these thickly packed formations saw the presence of this kind of stronger and beefy and even there were usually also the NCO's assistants and so on that had to physically push those who were kind of falling back or moving in directions they didn't have to move, and to exploiting their physical prowess in the process. So on the bigger scale, it was usually and practically always the right part of the phalanx that was considered the best, also where the commander was usually, and where that had to make the greatest effort, and this in this sense was also the very often, as it would happen also in this battle of Delium, the left flank was to collapse, while the right one was the one who probably would meet with more success. So sometimes it happened that, in fact, one was winning on everybody was winning on their own right and losing on their own left. So the Thebans were now kind of betting on the ability of their right section, the Boeotians, let's say, on the right section, with the Thebans that had to on the right that had to launch themselves with this very deep formation into the enemy, trying to break into it. And excuse me, differently from cavalry, also infantry has this ability of pushing the guys who are in the front from the posterior ranks. So the autismos in Greek is exactly this one. This idea of this physical push towards the front that is transmitted physically through the hoplites. Something with cavalry you can't do, for instance, because the horses are separated. Also, they need space to maneuver. There is no pressing in this sense. In fact, cavalry formations are usually not deep at all. Also, depending on how they're deployed, but where they're in line, usually they're to charge, it's usually the first ranks. Instead, with the phalanx, you could do this collective push of all the unit, all the formation towards the front. And given always that naturally the best troops were in the front, because they were the ones that had to lead the push, let's say, and to at the same time to keep formation cohesive. So naturally there was a huge emphasis put on the reliability of the first ranks. And there were also the place of honor, the one that everybody would like to be into the phalanx, but also the more risky, and also the one that in fact in this sense had the best equipment, because they needed also to be better defended, as maybe the rest of the hoplites in the posterior ranks maybe didn't even have a kind of great equipment. Sometimes the push could be carried out also by unarmed people that were there. Also, all these light troops that we find were kind of also the sheer look at of these masses of men was also kind of intimidating by itself. Never underestimate the psychological aspect; it is always more important than the physical one. So going on, chapter 94. On the side of the Athenians, the heavy infantry throughout the whole army formed 8 deep, being in numbers equal to the enemy, with the cavalry upon the 2 wings. Light troops regularly armed there were known in the army, nor had there ever been any at Athens. Those who had joined in the invasion, though many times more numerous than those of the enemy, had mostly followed unarmed, as part of the levying mass of the citizens and foreigners of Athens, and having started first on their way home, were not present in any number. The armies being now in line and upon the point of engaging, Hippocrates the general passed along the Athenian ranks and encouraged them as follows. So before this speech, here it is important, first of all, the fact that the Athenian phalanx was deployed in 8 deep, which was the kind of the standard depth of the classical politic phalanxes, and with the cavalry on the 2 wings as well. And here it says that the Athenian phalanx was equal to the one of the enemy in number, so given this lesser depth, they somewhat had a wider front than the Theban one. So the Athenians probably they were thinking of outflanking the enemy as well, also given the cavalry placed on the 2 wings having a larger front to maneuver. There were no light troops regularly armed in the Athenian army. This is also very important because in this sense the Athenians were kind of more at this point kind of more standard in the composition of the army. And there were also lots of unarmed troops as well. So here Hippocrates started his speech, and is brief. It says, "Athenians, I shall only say a few words to you." It is one of the most famous quotes from Thucydides. But brave men require no more, and they are addressed more to your understanding than to your courage. This is a very beautiful phrase. None of you must fancy that we are going out of our way to run this risk in the country of another. Fought in their territory, the battle will be for ours. If we conquer, the Peloponnesian will never invade your country without the Boeotian horse, and in one battle you will win Boeotia, and in a manner free Attica. Advance to meet them, then, like citizens of a country in which you all glory, as the first in Hellas, and like sons of the fathers who beat them at Enophita and Myronides, and thus gained possession of Boeotia. So this is also a very interesting speech. It tells how this idea that the understanding is more important than courage. This is kind of a mantra of the Hellenic Warfare at the time. I mean, the idea that courage is important, definitely, but the Greeks win through reason, not through courage. Every barbarian can be courageous, definitely, but what makes the difference is knowing what to do. Also, in this more kind of civilized fashion, the idea how this thing works. As an army, as a formation, and this is it. And to the brave men, a few words are enough to understand. So I'll be brief, essentially, and it was brief. And then it says these other interesting strategical considerations instead on the relation between Attica and Boeotia, as it says that practically by defeating the Boeotians in this battle, the Spartans essentially and their allies of the Peloponnese would never be able to attack Attica, because of the support that the Thebans gave regularly to the Boeotians gave regularly to the Peloponnesians in their raids into Attica. You can't do much of a raid without horses, for instance, and we've seen how the Spartans were poor in horses. And at the same time, he tells them, if we win this, we've taken Thebes. This is important because objectively these phalanxes represented a bit like the real bulk of the city. These were all the citizens who were fighting, and if you wipe them out, this meant that the tide was turned. You could have so the Athenians at this point were counting on, as we've seen, on the part of the democratic partisans in Boeotia to seize Thebes. And therefore a major defeat of the Theban army, of the Boeotian army in open field, in a pitched battle, would very likely knock out Thebes out of the war and all its Boeotian allies, and this would give Athens a huge edge. So now it didn't go like that, if you know how the story went, but it's important because it tells you how history could have gone in a wholly different way if even this battle of Delium had been won. And consider that now the Athenians had a great edge after the battle of Pylos and Sphacteria, because at this point the Spartans were not faring very well. So even the fact the Athenians in the first place were turning to Boeotia was to say, okay, if you knock these out, there's not even need to continue fighting against the Spartans because they will have no help anymore. And then here it recalls the other victories that the Athenians had gained over the Boeotians, but this is very rhetorical, just like in Pagondas' speech before, it did the same thing. So here we're chapter 96. This is really the battle, and let's give a look to how it went. And I give you also the let's see. I don't know where to switch picture. Let's see. I'm just reading. So Hippocrates had got half through the army with his exhortation when the Boeotians, after a few more hasty words from Pagondas, struck up to the pan and came against them from the hill. The Athenians advancing to meet them and closing at a run. Now this is very important because here it basically Thucydides is saying that the Thebans attacked when Hippocrates was still addressing the army. Usually this happened when the battle, with the array, the army was already deployed, so there wasn't much of a huge surprise. But given also other hints we have, it seems like the Thebans were also counting on this kind of kind of, I can say fully surprise factor, but I mean the idea that they were using together. You have seen the Theban phalanx being 25 deep, and so all this. So the idea of really exploiting this impetus and kind of even unexpected situation to maximize the effects. So the Boeotians now have the favor also of they're coming down the hill, and the Athenians advance and closing at a run, even, interestingly enough. So just for saying that the phalanxes were not meant to run, telling the truth, but it happened. It could happen. This is naturally a problem because the more the phalanx runs and the more it breaks. and this doesn't sound like to have been done from a bunch of specialized troops to meet, I don't know, certain skirmishers in the front. This is kind of the whole phalanx doing it. So, and naturally, this is not very good because here the Athenians were. Well, the source doesn't says it explicitly, but at least the Thebans were coming down faster. So I don't know whether here I think it doesn't say it. I don't think the Athenians were running uphill at this point, but they still says at least says that they were running, and there is no evidence for the Thebans doing it. So it can also be seem like the Athenians were more hasty in some way at this point. Okay, also here it says that also Pagondas say a few more hasty words, like they were in a rush themselves, and trying to exploit maybe some situation we can't see here now because the source doesn't say it, but we have to stay to what Thucydides wrote. Then it says the extreme wing of neither army came into action, one like the other being stopped by the water courses in the way. The rest engaged with the utmost obstinacy, shield against shield. So this is another very important detail because it basically says that the both of the armies' extreme wings, so essentially the cavalry and the light troops, couldn't meet because of essentially these water courses and other obstacles in the way. This is very interesting because, as we've seen, the Athenians had an edge on, from this point of view, on the wings compared to the Boeotians. So seemingly, because they had a wider line, and so now these wings not managing to enter into actions meant that they were kind of useless. So at this point, the Thebans had seemingly kind of I don't know, we don't know whether they did it on purpose because they knew the country, the terrain better, probably, but in this sense there were more Boeotians concentrated on the phalanx line than the Athenians, at least on the Boeotian right flank, the one where the Thebans had deployed in 25 ranks deep. And here it says the Boeotian left, as far as the center, was worsted by the Athenians. The Tespians in that part of the field suffered most severely. The troops alongside them having given way, they were surrounded in a narrow space and cut down, fighting hand to hand. Some of the Athenians also fell into confusion in surrounding the enemy and mistook and so killed each other. Excuse me, I write here when we have to change picture. Okay, so this is the first, this is important because it basically tells you that at a certain point the Tespians, that were on the Boeotian left flank, were suffering from the Athenian right, essentially. Were suffering more severely on the whole phalanx, Boeotian phalanx. This is important because, as we have seen, the best troops were deployed in the right of the phalanx, and usually the left was kind of the weakest one. So what happened on the the Boeotian left and the Athenian right was kind of, can say expected, but it kind of sounds reasonable given these premises. Okay, so the troops alongside them, I mean the Tespians, having given way, they were surrounded in a narrow space and cut down, fighting hand to hand. Some of the Athenians also fell into confusion in surrounding the enemy and mistook and so killed each other. Now this is a very beautiful picture, because before you see that there was this normal battle, that was at this point kind of a merely phalanx battle, as we've seen, because the wings were not engaged. So now it was really only the hoplites were fighting, shield against shield, Thucydides says, was kind of the standard of the hoplite tactics at this point. Now, when the Tespians break, here it says that they get surrounded by the Athenians in a narrow space. This is very important because they were kind of, and fighting hand to hand. So this is important because it stresses how much probably the Tespian formation and also the Athenian one actually had broken in this process. And just think, the Athenians now here, it literally, the Athenian right surrounded the Tespians. So, and here Thucydides says one of the most interesting things actually, that the Athenians also fell into confusion, having won on the right. And this was a kind of a risky business. Remember the battle of Marathon, for instance, when the Athenians managed to, actually in that case, to keep cohesion, especially enclosing the Persians on the flanks, but eventually breaking in the pursuit and suffering heavy losses when they arrived to the Persian ships. Now here they weren't suffering much of losses because the Tespians now were kind of losing, so they were now being butchered down essentially in this narrow space which you couldn't maneuver in. But the same Athenians disordered themselves, also because this was a rectangular unit. Now they were encircling the enemy, so this was a kind of a shapeless mass of men, that had lost the cohesion of the formation. We have said many times on Schwerpunkt that in a unit, we said it before, men are not deployed randomly. There is always an order that makes the unit functioning. You can't mix all the numbers and thinking that unit is still able to work. So when this unit loses cohesion, it's really going to hand-to-hand combat. So also a type of combat at this point was not carried out with spears, but also with these, the xiphoid, these Greek swords that hoplites had normally. The Athenians and the Thebans were, as far as we know, were not trained specifically to use swords, but it's something you still can use. Only the Spartans were trained in individual combat with swords, incidentally, but also that was not the main. That was just a secondary weapon. But at this point, the Athenians do this, and interestingly enough, as we have said, by encircling the Tespians, the Athenians even probably reached each other from both sides in the rear of the Tespians, and they mistook them and killed each other. This is very important because you realize also how not standardized, how there weren't uniforms at the time. At this point, hoplites are still wearing essentially, I think it's just from the beginning of the 4th century that in the Greek armies were issued specific colors for distinguish each other clearly. And the Peloponnesian War pushed towards this, because eventually also these new battlegrounds that were more rugged and brought also to the disconnection of the army had caused such incidents, for which you met certain hoplites you basically couldn't recognize. You have to imagine naturally, that there were certain troops that were, they bore on the shield certain pictures. There were certain standard banners as well, but the idea is that we're covered in dirt, in dust, in blood, and all this stuff. You in the confusion of a battle, you don't know who you're facing. Also the visual experience of such battles was pretty confused, and therefore the Athenians in this case kind of start killing each other behind the Tespians, in this, having encircled them. And this is, I think, one of the first evidence in military history of things like friendly fire, that as always, I mean, there is no fire involved in here, not even because they were throwing things at each other. These were just like hoplites, seemingly. Although I'm sure light troops were interspersed among them as well. But friendly fires always existed, ever. But this shows how not uniform. The troops were at this point, and how the recognition of the enemy usually happened in this very kind of staged warfare that was not staged so much at this point as we have seen from the original times. You identified the enemy just from the unit on the field. So these new battlefields were kind of more messed up, produced also this problem that had not presented before, not understanding where the enemy was. Because when you are phalanx versus phalanx, you have the enemy in the front and you can see him. You know that guy, even if you don't know his heraldry on the shield, if you don't know what they are, but you see that they are that massive man that came against you. And all it took was to break it and to run and to stick to your, close to your comrades, and that was it, substantially. Now instead, when things got messed up, it was even very difficult to recognize the enemy in the absence, friends and enemy, friend and enemy alike, in the absence of further distinguishing elements. Then it goes on. It says, in this part of the field, the Boeotians, oh my god, my pronunciation of Boeotian is terrible. Boeotians were beaten and retreated upon the troops still fighting. But the right, where the Thebans were, got the better of the Athenians and shoved them in further and further back, though gradually at first. So similarly, the Thebans are able, on their the Boeotian right, made up of the Thebans, is able to make the Athenian left gradually withdraw. Given we have seen the push of this 25 deep formation. Interestingly enough, it's Thucydides adds, though gradually at first. So the idea that also the phalanx is able to keep cohesion in spite of this pressing, so on. So you can imagine really in fact here the shield by shield, so not an impact, it comes suddenly, but it's really a matter of pushing in, and of shifting slowly the enemy formation, making it gradually collapse only after a lot of through exhaustion, not through violent impact, but through just pushing constantly, relentlessly. Goes on. It so happened also that Pagondas, seeing the distress of his left, had sent 2 squadrons of horse, where they could not be seen, round the hill, and their sudden appearance struck a panic into the victorious wing of the Athenians, who thought that it was another army coming against them. This is very interesting also. It shows the importance of this battlefield also in the way it was conceived. So the Theban commander had hidden a pair of squadrons of cavalry behind the hill, so concealing this force and making it struck basically on the Athenians. Were on the Athenian right, was, as we have seen now, scattered around the Tespians and butchering them down. So Pagondas realizes this sends this hidden reserve against the Athenians, and the Athenians are struck into panic. Although they had been just victorious over the enemy left, so also see how morale can really shift given this sudden odds. And then it says the Athenians thought that was a whole another army coming against them. Then it goes on. At length, in both parts of the field, disturbed by this panic, and with their line broken by the advancing Thebans, the whole Athenian army took to flight. So it's simple as that. All this preparation, objectively, this is how it happened. It's kind of pretty normal, because you're just imagine to be an Athenian now. From the Athenian side, your left is kind of collapsing against the push of the Thebans. The right is just victorious, but something happens. Enemy cavalry arriving, who they are, where they come from, how many are they. You're right that it has lost completely cohesion. It's the best part of your army at this point. It gets wiped out and struck to panic, so the whole thing collapses. It's normal. It happens not so suddenly, but, everything is lost. You can't go on more than much. This is how these phenomena kind of happen during the field. It's mostly it's primarily a psychological dynamic than a physical one. It's about the confusion. It's about know what's going on. It's about your fear, your psychophysical exhaustion. So, for instance, here it doesn't matter that we don't know much about the center, even though I think Thucydides said before that also on the centers the Boeotians weren't faring pretty well. But nevertheless, it just takes the right to be collapsing and the left to be under heavy pressure to make the whole thing collapse, and the Athenian army breaks and flies. Then Thucydides goes on and says, some made for Delium and the sea, some for Oropus, others for Mount Parnes, or wherever they had hopes of safety. Excuse me, I tell you where this is changing. This is kind of very interesting in the essentials. How you see all these directions that the enemy, the Athenians are taking, fleeing. Pursued and cut down by the Boeotians, and in particular by the cavalry. This is what we were saying before, composed partly of Boeotians and partly of Locrians, who had come up just as the rout began. And this is interesting because you realize also these armies were even difficult to put together. There were these kind of the distances, as we've seen, were very short in this strategical theater. So it was a matter even of a few hours that a contingent could come, and everything was done. Also, you've seen how the Boeotians had attacked rather hastily when the Athenians were already withdrawing. So a situation that was very dynamic. And the Locrians here added just to the cavalry that manages to slaughter the fleeing enemy. Night, however, coming to interrupt the pursuit, the mass of the fugitives escaped more easily than they would otherwise have done. This is important because we have seen before, we didn't stress it, that the battle had began somewhat late in the day, in the afternoon. So this also was a factor that the night was falling. So also many Athenians kind of saved their skins thanks to the darkness. The next day, the troops at Oropus and Delium returned home by sea, after leaving a garrison in the latter place, which they continued to hold, notwithstanding the defeat. This is important because Delium, as we have seen, had become a sort of rallying point of these fleeing troops, and yet there was a garrison that was kept in there. So now the Boeotians have taken the field. It says, Chapter 97, the Boeotians set up a trophy, took up their own dead, and stripped those of the enemy, and leaving a guard over them, retired to Tanagra, there to take measures for attacking Delium. So this is normal. At the end of the battle, the victor set up a trophy, they took their own dead, they stripped those of the enemy, because also equipment here was something precious, and they retreat to this center of Tanagra that is, as you see here in the map, is pretty close. Just a few, like not even 10 kilometers, so something you can do easily, relatively easily. But at this point there is not much of a tactical dynamism because the Athenian army is being annihilated. They're fleeing back to Attica. There is no danger anymore. So the main problem now is to take Delium, as there is just a small garrison while the Thebans have the whole army, so they want to attack it. And it wasn't an easy task, as we've said before. These fortifications were not so easy to, but at least there was no Athenian army in the surroundings, so it was kind of feasible to surround it and to attempt a siege and storming it. So then it adds other details. They're nevertheless, maybe they're not so important, but they're nevertheless interesting. And it says, meanwhile, a herald came from the Athenians to ask for the dead, but was met and turned back by the Boeotian herald, who told him that it would effect nothing until the return of himself to the Boeotian herald. And who then went on to the Athenians and told them on the part of the Boeotians that they had done wrong in transgressing the law of the Hellenians. This is important because seizing the sanctuary of Apollo, they kind of had done something sacrilegious. Here it's interesting that all these kind of also different polis that fought each other still thought to be all Hellenes, and to have sort of common law, common identity, common tongue, and so on. Of what use was the universal custom protecting the temples in an invaded country if the Athenians were to fortify Delium and live there, acting exactly as if they were on unconsecrated ground, and drawing and using for their purposes the water which they, the Boeotians, never touch except for sacred uses? Accordingly, for the god as well as for themselves, in the name of the deities concerned and of Apollo, the Boeotians invited them first to evacuate the temple if they wished to take up the dead that belonged to them. So kind of fair. The Boeotians told the Athenians basically, we won't give you your dead until you don't move out of Apollo's sanctuary, which is sacred, and we Boeotians have done nothing against you. You instead have done this thing, essentially this crime against our own religion, our own collective religion as Hellenes and so on. After these words from the herald, the Athenians sent their own herald to the Boeotians to say that they had not done anything wrong to the temple, and for the future would do it no more harm than they could help, not having occupied it originally in any such design, but to defend themselves from it against those who were really wronging them. The law of the Hellenes, and they were kind of, here there is no really left or right, but it's just now it's interesting that the Athenians answered them. We invaded. First of all, we did nothing wrong to the sanctuary when we seized it. But secondly, we attacked just to defend ourselves, and there is a bit of truth in here, as we've seen the Boeotians launch these raids into Attica, and now the Athenians had done this just to prevent also partly the law of the Hellenes was that the conquest of a country, whether more or less extensive, carried with it possession of temples in that country, with the obligation to keep up the usual ceremonies, at least as far as possible. The Boeotians and most of other people who had turned out the owners of a country and put themselves in their places by force now held as a right the temples which they originally entered as usurpers. If the Athenians could have conquered more of Boeotia, this would have been the case with them. As things stood, the piece of it which they had got they should treat as their own, and not quit unless obliged. The water they had disturbed under the impulsion of a necessity which they had not wantonly incurred, having been forced to use it in defending themselves against the Boeotians who had first invaded Attica. Besides, anything done under the pressure of war and danger might reasonably claim indulgence even in the eye of the god. Or why, pray, were the altars the asylum for involuntary offences? Transgression also was a term applied to the presumptuous offenders, not the victims of adverse circumstances. In short, which were most impious, the Boeotians who wished to barter dead bodies for holy places, or the Athenians who refused to give up holy places to obtain what was theirs by right? The condition of evacuating Boeotia must therefore be withdrawn. They were no longer in Boeotia. They stood where they stood by the right of the sword, and all the Boeotians had to do was to tell them to take up their dead under truce according to the national custom. So it's kind of a clever answer. The Athenians were usually able to provide them with such. And so they're smart. They're saying essentially, we just conquer these places, because it's normal that when you conquer a place, you also conquer their sacred, altars and sanctuaries and so on. And the duty of the conqueror is just to, to keep on the local rites, to appease the gods and so on. And now the Boeotians wanted just to trade the sanctuary for the bodies of the Athenians. So this was also kind of sacrilegious in turn, a bit of a diplomatic skirmishers at this point. So the Boeotians replied that if they were in Boeotia, they must evacuate that country before taking up their dead. If they were in their own territory, they could do as they pleased, for they knew that, although the roped were the bodies as it chanced, were lying the battle, having been fought on the borders, was subject to Athens, yet the Athenians could not get them without their leave. Besides, why should they grant a truce for Athenian ground? And what could be fairer than to tell them to evacuate Boeotia if they wished to get what they asked? The Athenian herald accordingly returned with this answer without having accomplished his object. Well, at this point it was just, kind of jerking around. And not really, the situation was very, very different. So now we get to the end of this, chapter 100. Because here the Boeotians managed to storm Delium with this clever thing that they created, that was essentially a machinery that here Thucydides describes also as a... we'll see it now. Meanwhile, the Boeotians at once sent for darters and slingers from the Malian Gulf, and with 2,000 Corinthian heavy infantry who had joined them after the battle, the Peloponnesian garrison, which had evacuated Nisaea, and some Megarians with them, marched against Delium and attacked the fort, and after diverse efforts finally succeeded in taking it by an engine of the following description. Now, first of all, it's interesting that they called up this darters and slingers also for siege warfare, and slingers were definitely very good at it. They could create a kind of suppression fire on the ramparts to let the attackers climb the walls and storm in them. And so you see also these 2,000 Corinthian heavy infantry. It's not a few, and other troops. So here Thucydides describes finally the engine that was used to storm Delium. They sewed in two and scooped out a great beam from end to end, and fitted it nicely together again like a pipe, hung by chains, a cauldron on the extremity, with which communicated an iron tube projecting from the beam, which was itself in great part plated with iron. This they brought up from a distance upon carts to the part of the wall principally composed of wines and timber, and when it was near, inserted huge bellows into their end of the beam and blew with them. The blast, passing closely confined into the cauldron, which was filled with lighted coals, sulphur, and pitch, made a great blaze, and set fire to the wall, which soon became untenable for its defenders, who left it and fled. And in this way the fort was taken. Of the garrison, some were killed, and 200 made prisoners. Most of the rest got on board the ships and returned home. So I think we stop here with Thucydides, and this is very interesting, very clever. This idea of kind of it was basically flamethrower. It was this tube that was filled with air, with oxygen from the one end, and the other hand it had this cauldron with coal that could, in this sense, keep the combustion on, and pitch and sulfur. So shooting air into it made it a huge flame, and this set on fire this part of the Delium ramparts that were made in wine and timber, so inflammable material, and that area was basically destroyed. As it was very clever, as you understand, but there is not also much more to say about it, and just for saying that the Boeotians here made it kind of the best choices. Like, they understood the need of attacking, which was, it went well. It could also go wrong, but they kind of acted cleverly. They were lucky. They were told initially by that betrayer that what the Athenians were doing, so they managed to counter effectively on the Corinthian, the Athenian landing on the Corinthian Gulf. So the Demosthenes arrived there. They saw that the Boeotians had already occupied those lands. They couldn't even land and had to come back to, I think, to Athens directly. Secondarily, of course, the Thebans didn't arrive in time to essentially prevent the Athenians to fortify Delium, but they arrived in time to basically to catch the Athenian army while it was retreating, and they managed to exploit very cleverly, and this thanks to the Pagondas, the Theban command at that point, the terrain. They develop, they deploy on this hill, where they also able to conceal certain reserves. They use this probably very clever way of deepening the ranks of the right flank to smash the left one, so to ensure there's a more effective measure. We don't know how extremely successful it really was. I mean, the Athenian left might have been, defeated also. Maybe if the Thebans had not deployed 25 deep, we don't know it from the source, but we can speculate that that was also kind of a winning measure. Pagondas is able to send not to lose his mind when the left the Boeotian left was breaking, and he sends this cavalry in, so he manages to seize the very best of the. Oh, by the way, Hippocrates died in battle. Just telling you guys the sad news, and this is important because it shows, from one side, the limits of the phalanx, of the hoplite in itself. I mean, the idea that when it breaks, the whole cohesion ceases to exist. So in here, lighter troops, in this case cavalry, the strong Boeotian cavalry, is used exactly for what it had to do. Attack an enemy that has loosened the guard, that even if represents the best of the phalanx, now it's scattered, so it's mostly vulnerable, and to annihilate it, and the whole Athenian army flees. And cherry on top is this clever measure of using this machine that basically blasted the fortifications at Delium, so that it adds harm to injury, in the sense that not only the Athenians, now there was all that negotiations for recovering the bodies of the Athenian dead and so on, but the Thebans are able to storm Delium on their own with this clever thing. And we don't know whether Thucydides was, we don't know how much this machinery was, this engine was effectively, the cause for Delium to fall, because that point we don't know. Maybe the garrison the Athenians had left was stronger, weaker, we don't really know, but it's interesting nevertheless that the author wanted to stress the importance of this machinery, because it was showing essentially the Boeotians showing the Athenians, this is the most important thing, that basically could do it. They were not scared even by the fortifications that were doing it. So doing something clever that the Athenians had not expected. So not just you got crushed in a battle and your army was annihilated, but also this garrison, this fortifications you had spent time and energy and resources to build could be wiped out so easily. Also, the timing of the battle is interesting, because the Athenians probably were retreating at one point, because the day was coming almost to an end. So also this fact that not all the Athenians were massacred, or at least most of them, just because night eventually ensued, is kind of interesting as well. I just was thinking about it in relatively to the decision of attack late in the day. I mean, that added, from one side, it added to the risk of the battle because, it actually tells us it's a positive thing the Pagondas did, because when you attack, there was evidently time for a full engagement, and even if the battle had prolonged itself during up to the end of the day, without the defeat of the Athenians, the Boeotians had their hill, and their rear. They could retreat more easily. They were in their own ground, and the Athenians, after all, up to that point, were just retreating. So they probably didn't expect this engagement to occur. So Pagondas was able to exploit this situation to practically also ensure that that was the right moment to do, because we have seen to attack the Boeotians wanted to go home, and he takes them and says, what are you doing? And he doesn't mention these elements, these kind of more strategical elements into the speech, but nevertheless, it still he gives that's important, because in the speech, as it's reported by Thucydides, here it's important what actually he said, not what he thought, and he was just essentially addressing the fact that these Athenians have attacked us. And this is our own soil. If we let them do whatever they want in here, we're kind of lost, and this is outrageous, and so on. They've taken our temple. So all things that were boosting, the pride and morale through the pride of the Thebans. And then there is also these other factors we don't know what in Pagondas' mind, but Pagondas was in this sense a good commander. He made the right choices, and he obtained what he did. So very interesting battle, into which you realize that also the classical political warfare was kind of at this point changing form, as you want to see it, and evolving towards something else. And the interesting aspect is that the Boeotians were in fact considered kind of less Greek than the other Greeks, were kind of on the lead on certain developments, exploiting essentially what their potentials were. So also this half barbaric way, like the Athenians conceived the Boeotians, like gave them this ability to use something that went beyond the mere traditional warfare and to exploit all these elements to achieve success. So this is how also civilization evolves, and Thebes was about in a couple of generations to provide also this very important evolution in the Hellenic Warfare, that also would be kind of also the threshold of the Hellenistic warfare, because essentially also with the Battle of Leuctra there is the evidence that warfare had to change into another direction, towards more flexibility, to more specialization, and the Thebans made a lot. Also, Thebes was in part the place from which the Macedonian Phalanx was conceived, because it actually it was Iphicrates who was experimenting also in Thebes certain new developments of the Phalanx by lengthening the spear and making the troops lighter, more flexible, using other. And this all starts from, these are the roots of it, even if they were not so evident in here, because nobody could foresee at this point what would happen in 1 century, but or even less actually. But it's at this point that those necessary conditions that were there were essentially being exploited to eventually towards that direction of evolution. And so it is important to remember this battle, and I hope that you enjoyed this video. If you did, please share it, otherwise leave a like, or subscribe to my channel if you are interested in my upcoming contents. And for now, I thank you heartily for listening to me. I wish you a nice time and see you next time. Bye.